What happens when an arrogant lawyer mocks a black man for representing himself, only to realize he just made the biggest mistake of his career? Garrett Langford is a high-powered attorney who thinks he's untouchable. When he faces off against Leonard Grayson, an older man without a legal team, he's certain it'll be an easy win. But what he doesn't know, Leonard is no ordinary defendant. And by the time Langford figures out who he really is, it's already too late. A courtroom battle, a shocking revelation, and a brutal takedown no one saw coming. Stay tuned, because this is a legal showdown you don't want to miss. Before we continue, make sure to like the video and subscribe the channel so the community can grow and we can bring you more stories like this. Now, let's get into it. The courtroom was thick with tension, the kind that made spectators lean in, hungry for drama. Rows of polished benches held a mix of reporters, law students, and idle onlookers who had caught wind of the peculiar case. At the defense table sat a tall, well-dressed man in an expensive navy blue suit, Garrett Langford, a high-powered attorney with a reputation for dismantling his opponents with surgical precision. His smug smirk was legendary. He had never lost a case. At the other table, sitting alone, was a man in his late 50s, Leonard Grayson. He was black, bald, and wore a simple, neatly pressed suit that didn't scream money. No legal team, no assistant, no fancy briefcase, just him and a few neatly stacked papers. Langford eyed him with amused disbelief. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath. "They really let you represent yourself?" Leonard glanced up, his deep brown eyes calm, unreadable. "Yes, Mr. Langford, they did." Langford chuckled, shaking his head. "This is going to be over before lunch." He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss. This man clearly lacks the legal expertise to proceed. This is a waste of the court's time." Judge Hamilton, an older woman with sharp eyes, adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Langford, Mr. Grayson has the right to represent himself." Langford sighed dramatically. "Of course, let's entertain this circus then." He shot Leonard a condescending smile. "Don't take this personally, old man. I'll try to go easy on you." Leonard smiled back, a small, knowing smile. "I appreciate that." The case began. It was a business dispute. Langford's client, a wealthy real estate developer, was accused of fraudulently seizing land from longtime black-owned businesses through shady legal loopholes. The victims had fought for years, but against Langford's aggressive litigation tactics, most had settled or been forced into silence. Most, but not Leonard Grayson. Langford strutted to the center of the room, adjusting his gold cufflinks. "Mr. Grayson," he began, his voice dripping with mock politeness, "since you've chosen to handle your own defense, I assume you're familiar with the laws governing commercial property disputes." Leonard nodded. "Quite." Langford smirked. "Fantastic. Then you must know the legal precedent set in—" Leonard cut him off. "Morgan v. Patterson, 1982. The ruling determined that contracts obtained through deceptive means are voidable at the victim's discretion." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Langford blinked. That was correct. "Lucky guess," he told himself. Langford recovered. "Impressive. But surely you're also aware of the amendment to the Commercial Property Act in—" Leonard interrupted again, his tone still even. "In 2003, when the courts ruled that prior fraudulent intent invalidates title transfers, even if signed under seemingly legal conditions." Another murmur. Langford's smirk faltered. Leonard leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "Mr. Langford, you should know. I don't guess, I know." Langford's confidence wavered for the first time. Who was this man? A flicker of irritation crossed Langford's face, but he quickly masked it with another smirk. "Well, well, looks like you've done some reading. But let's see how well you can handle actual litigation." He turned on his heel, striding toward the witness stand where his client, Ronald Baxter, sat with a bored expression. Baxter was a multi-millionaire real estate mogul, the kind who had turned evictions into an art form. "Mr. Baxter," Langford began, his voice silky smooth, "is it true that you acquired the properties in question through legal transactions?" Baxter nodded. "Yes." "And did any of the previous owners object at the time of sale?" "No." Langford shot a victorious glance at Leonard. "There you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Grayson's case is built on the illusion of injustice when, in reality, my client conducted business lawfully." Leonard remained unfazed. He stood slowly, adjusting his tie as he walked toward the witness stand. "Mr. Baxter," he said, his voice even, "you claim the sales were legal. But would you care to explain why you personally visited several property owners before the transactions, offering them friendly advice about how difficult it would be to hold on to their land?" Baxter's jaw tightened. "I don't recall." Leonard arched an eyebrow. "Really? Because I have signed affidavits from 3 former business owners stating that you showed up unannounced, hinting at impending legal troubles if they didn't sell." Langford jumped up. "Objection. Speculative and irrelevant." Judge Hamilton barely glanced at him. "Overruled. Continue, Mr. Grayson." Leonard turned back to Baxter. "Do you deny that your company hired private investigators to dig into these owners' finances, looking for ways to pressure them?" Baxter shifted uncomfortably. "That's a standard business practice." Leonard nodded. "Ah, I see. And would you also call it standard to have city inspectors suddenly show up days after your visits, citing multiple violations and issuing fines?" The courtroom murmured again. Baxter's face darkened. Langford's smirk was gone now. He stood up, his voice sharp. "Enough of this. Mr. Grayson, let's be honest. You're grasping at straws here. What are you, some small business owner who thinks he can play lawyer? Maybe you took a few online courses." He let out a mocking laugh. "Tell me, what exactly qualifies you to stand in this courtroom and challenge me?" Leonard simply looked at him. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a file. He walked over to the judge's bench, handed her the papers, and returned to his seat without a word. Judge Hamilton adjusted her glasses as she scanned the documents. Her expression shifted, first to surprise, then to something almost amused. She looked up at Langford. "Mr. Langford," she said, "I suggest you read this before making any more assumptions." Langford frowned, snatched the file from the clerk and flipped it open. Then his face went pale. Langford's eyes darted across the documents, his fingers tightening around the pages as he read. The courtroom was dead silent, everyone watching, waiting. His lips parted slightly as if he wanted to say something, but no words came out. Leonard sat back watching the arrogant lawyer's confidence unravel. Judge Hamilton cleared her throat. "Well, Mr. Langford?" Langford swallowed hard, forcing a laugh. This must be a mistake." Leonard finally spoke, his voice calm. "No mistake." Langford looked up, his face pale but his tone still dripping with disbelief. "You're—" He hesitated. Leonard finished the sentence for him. "A former federal prosecutor." "Yes." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even the reporters at the back sat up straighter, their pens flying across their notepads. Langford's client, Baxter, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Garrett, what is he talking about?" Langford ignored him, still flipping through the pages as if the words would change. He shook his head. I've never heard of you." Leonard chuckled softly. "That doesn't surprise me. My last case was nearly 20 years ago. But back then, I didn't just practice law. I shaped it. I was one of the lead prosecutors in United States v. Halverson, the largest corporate fraud case of its time. I spent years dismantling corrupt organizations, sending men far more powerful than your client to prison." Langford's mouth went dry. Leonard leaned forward. "So, you see, Mr. Langford, this isn't my first time in a courtroom. And it certainly isn't my first time facing someone who thinks they're untouchable. Langford forced another laugh, but it sounded hollow. So what? That was decades ago. You're retired. A has-been. Leonard nodded. That's what I thought too. I had no intention of returning to the legal world, but then I saw what your client was doing. I saw good people being destroyed, not because they were weak, but because no one was willing to fight for them. He paused, his gaze steady. So, I decided to step back in. Langford clenched his jaw. This changes nothing. He straightened his tie, his arrogance flickering back to life. You might have been someone once, but this is still my case, and I'm still going to win. Leonard shrugged. We'll see. Judge Hamilton exhaled, tapping her gavel lightly. Let's proceed. Mr. Grayson, you may continue your cross-examination. Leonard turned back to Baxter. Now, Mr. Baxter, where were we? Ah, yes. You were explaining how your company's standard business practices just so happen to align perfectly with your personal financial interests. Baxter shifted again, his face growing red. Langford, still gripping the documents, knew one thing for certain. This case was no longer a guaranteed win. And, for the first time in his career, he felt something unfamiliar creeping in. Doubt. Langford squared his shoulders, forcing himself to stay composed. This wasn't over. He had faced tough opponents before, and he wasn't about to let some retired prosecutor make a fool out of him. But deep down, something gnawed at him, a feeling he wasn't used to. Unease. Leonard turned back to Baxter, his expression unreadable. Mr. Baxter, let's talk about those property acquisitions again. Baxter let out an exasperated sigh. I already told you, everything was legal. Leonard nodded. Right, legal, just like the contract your company signed with Whitmore Bank to secure the loans for these purchases. Baxter's brows knitted. What does that have to do with anything? Leonard glanced at the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence a copy of the loan agreement between Baxter Holdings and Whitmore Bank. Langford jumped up. Objection. This document wasn't submitted in discovery. The defense had no opportunity to review it. Leonard didn't even blink. It's public record, Mr. Langford. Anyone with the right credentials could access it, especially a competent attorney. Langford's jaw tensed, but he said nothing. Judge Hamilton gestured for Leonard to proceed. Overruled. Let's see it. The clerk handed the document to the judge, then to Langford and Baxter. As soon as Langford scanned the fine print, his stomach dropped. Leonard turned back to Baxter, his voice smooth and deliberate. Mr. Baxter, do you recall the clause on page 12 of this contract? Baxter's eyes darted over the page. He hesitated. Leonard saved him the trouble. Allow me. The clause explicitly states that should there be any evidence of fraudulent intent in acquiring properties with the bank's loaned funds, the contract is void. Which means, he turned to the judge, every property Mr. Baxter acquired under this agreement is now in legal jeopardy. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Langford felt a bead of sweat form at his temple. Baxter shot him a panicked look. Garrett, do something. Langford flipped through the contract, desperately searching for a loophole. There had to be something. Mr. Langford? Leonard's voice was calm, patient. Would you like to challenge the validity of this document? Langford knew better than to take that bait. If he objected now, he'd have to explain why they hadn't already disclosed the clause. Worse, it would make them look guilty. Instead, he exhaled sharply. This doesn't prove fraud. Leonard tilted his head. No? Then perhaps we should ask the bank. He pulled out another document. Because as of this morning, Whitmore Bank has initiated an internal review of Baxter Holdings' loan agreement. Langford's pulse pounded. Leonard continued, his voice steady. If they find wrongdoing, and I have no doubt they will, your client won't just lose these properties. He let the words sink in. He'll be looking at federal charges." Baxter's face turned ghostly pale. Langford had lost control, and he knew it. Baxter gripped the edge of the witness stand, his knuckles turning white. You can't do this," he sputtered. "This is entrapment." Leonard raised an eyebrow. "Entrapment? No, Mr. Baxter. This is accountability." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, a wave of hushed excitement rolling through the spectators. Reporters scribbled furiously, some already typing updates on their phones. Langford took a deep breath, trying to rein in the chaos unraveling before him. He couldn't let this spiral out of control. "Your Honor," he said quickly, "I move to strike all references to Whitmore Bank's review as speculative and prejudicial." Judge Hamilton sighed. "Mr. Langford, Mr. Grayson just presented a signed document confirming the review. That's not speculation. The motion is denied." Langford clenched his fists. Leonard turned his attention back to Baxter. "Let's set the bank matter aside for a moment. I want to go back to the property owners you displaced." Baxter wiped his forehead. "I didn't displace anyone. I made offers. They accepted. That's how business works." Leonard nodded. "Right, just business. And tell me, Mr. Baxter, were you aware that some of these former property owners were served eviction notices for violating zoning laws, only weeks after refusing to sell to you?" Baxter swallowed hard. I don't know anything about that." Leonard flipped another page. "Interesting, because records show that those violations were reported by an anonymous tip." He leaned forward slightly. "Would you like to guess who submitted them?" Baxter's gaze darted to Langford, pleading for help. Langford gritted his teeth. "Objection. My client has no obligation to answer baseless accusations." Leonard smiled. "Of course. We wouldn't want him to perjure himself." He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence the city complaint records for each of the properties in question. You'll notice they all trace back to a single individual." The courtroom was dead silent as the clerk handed the documents over. Judge Hamilton's eyes scanned the pages. "Mr. Baxter," she said, looking over her glasses, "do you have an explanation for this?" Baxter's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Langford shot to his feet. "This is irrelevant. Even if my client reported code violations, that doesn't prove fraud." Leonard nodded. "You're right. But combined with the bank investigation, the coerced sales, and the targeted legal pressure, it does establish a pattern of unethical and potentially illegal conduct." He turned to the judge. "I believe the prosecution has more than enough reason to move forward with criminal charges." Judge Hamilton nodded. "I agree." She looked at the bailiff. "Court will adjourn for today. Mr. Baxter, you are hereby ordered to remain in the city pending further investigation." Baxter's face crumpled. Langford sat down, gripping the edge of the table. Leonard calmly gathered his papers. The fight was over, and he had won. Langford sat frozen, his mind racing. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He had walked into this courtroom expecting an easy victory, ready to humiliate an old man who thought he could play lawyer. But now, everything was crumbling. Baxter was trembling beside him, whispering frantically, "Fix this, Garrett. Do something." Langford took a slow breath, gripping the edges of the table. He wasn't out of moves yet. As the courtroom emptied, he strode toward Leonard, who was calmly packing his papers into his briefcase. Langford's tone was lower now, stripped of arrogance but still laced with defiance. "All right, Grayson," he said, "you got your little show today. But this case isn't over. I'll file motions, drag this out in court for years. My client has money, and you're just an old man playing hero." Leonard chuckled, snapping his briefcase shut. "You still don't get it, do you, Langford?" He turned, facing him fully. "This was never about money. It was about truth. And the truth is, your client's empire is built on deception." He leaned in slightly. "And you, Langford, are now tied to it." Langford scoffed. Please, I'll walk out of here, go to my office, and start preparing to dismantle your case. I don't lose. Leonard tilted his head. You might want to check your phone first. Langford frowned, pulling out his phone. The notifications were endless. Dozens of missed calls, emails, and messages. His firm's name was all over the news. Breaking. High-profile lawyer. Garrett Langford caught in legal scandal. Did he aid in fraud? His stomach dropped. What the hell? He scrolled through article after article, each one tearing into his firm, his reputation. Someone had leaked the evidence Leonard presented in court. The case wasn't just a courtroom battle anymore. It was a public spectacle. Leonard straightened his tie. Your client may have money, Langford, but now he has something worse. Attention. He smiled. Good luck handling that. Langford clenched his jaw. He wanted to fire back, to say something, anything, that would restore his sense of control. But for the first time in his career, he had nothing. Baxter, now visibly sweating, grabbed Langford's arm. They're going to investigate me. I can't go to prison, Garrett. You have to make this go away. Leonard turned to Baxter, his voice steady. You had a choice, Mr. Baxter. You could have built your business honestly. Instead, you chose greed. And now the law is catching up. Baxter opened his mouth to argue, but he had no defense. He knew it. Langford knew it. Leonard gave them both a final nod. I'll see you at the next hearing. Then he walked out, his steps slow, confident. Langford watched him go, his grip tightening on his phone. He had mocked Leonard Grayson. Now he feared him. Langford stood there, gripping his phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. The courtroom had nearly emptied, but the weight of what had just happened lingered like a storm cloud over his head. Baxter was still beside him, fidgeting, his face pale. What do we do now? He hissed. Langford didn't answer. He was too busy reading through the flood of emails from his firm. Urgent. PR crisis meeting at 6 p.m. We need to discuss your involvement in the Baxter case. Call ASAP. Clients are reconsidering contracts. Damage control needed immediately. Langford swallowed hard. This was spiraling out of control faster than he could manage. Baxter wasn't done panicking. Garrett, listen to me. I'm not going down for this. If this gets worse, I'll do whatever it takes to save myself. Langford's eyes snapped to him. What does that mean? Baxter wiped his forehead. It means that if the feds come knocking, I'll make a deal. If I have to throw you under the bus, I will. Langford stiffened. You wouldn't dare. Baxter scoffed. Please, you think I have loyalty to you? You were supposed to handle this. You let an old man wreck everything. Langford's jaw clenched. He had underestimated Leonard Grayson, and now his own client was turning on him. He should have seen this coming. Taking a deep breath, he lowered his voice. No one's making deals. We still have options. Baxter folded his arms. Like what? Langford exhaled sharply, scanning the courtroom. A few reporters were still lingering near the back, watching them. He lowered his voice. We need to discredit Grayson, make it seem like he's unstable, unreliable. Get some dirt on him. Baxter narrowed his eyes. You sure that'll work? Langford smirked, some of his confidence returning. People love a scandal. We just have to give them one. Baxter nodded slowly, but there was doubt in his eyes. Then you better work fast. Langford turned on his heel, storming out of the courtroom. His mind was already calculating his next move. 2 days later. The media frenzy hadn't died down. If anything, it had only intensified. News outlets were digging deeper into Baxter's business dealings, and whispers of a federal probe had started circulating. Langford sat in his office, scrolling through his laptop. His PR team had tried damage control, but the headlines weren't in his favor. Former prosecutor Leonard Grayson takes on corrupt developer, a legal battle for the ages. Garrett Langford's reputation on the line, Was he complicit in fraud? FBI launches preliminary review into Baxter Holdings transactions. Langford's phone buzzed. He picked it up. What? It's Baxter. His client's voice was tense. I just got word. Grayson filed a motion to freeze my assets. Langford's breath hitched. Leonard wasn't just after Baxter. He was coming for everything. Langford shot up from his chair, gripping the phone. He did what? Baxter's voice was raw with panic. If this goes through, I won't be able to move a damn cent. My accounts, my investments, everything will be locked. I need you to fix this. Now. Langford rubbed his temples, his mind racing. A frozen asset order meant Baxter was one step closer to total collapse, and worse, it meant Leonard had anticipated every move they might make. He took a deep breath. Calm down. It's just emotion. The judge hasn't approved it yet. Baxter wasn't convinced. You think they won't? The whole world is watching this case. My name is everywhere. I'll be ruined. Langford wasn't about to admit it, but he was thinking the same thing. Before he could respond, another call came in. His law firm's managing partner. His stomach dropped. I'll call you back, he muttered, hanging up on Baxter and answering the other call. The voice on the other end was cold. Garrett, we need to talk. Langford ran a hand through his hair. Look, I know what this is about. I just need time to... You don't have time, the partner cut in. The board has made a decision. Your involvement in this case is bringing too much negative attention. We can't afford the blowback. Langford gritted his teeth. Are you firing me? A pause. Then, we're asking for your resignation, effective immediately. Langford closed his eyes, fury surging through him. This firm was his life, his reputation, his power. And now, because of Leonard Grayson, it was all slipping away. You can't do this, he growled. We just did. The line went dead. Langford slammed his phone onto his desk, breathing hard. He had mocked Leonard, underestimated him. And now, the so-called old man had destroyed his career in a matter of days, but it wasn't over. Not yet. Later, that afternoon, Leonard sat in his modest home office, sipping tea as he read through the latest case updates. He knew Langford would try something desperate soon. Men like him didn't go down without a fight. A knock at his door. He set his cup down and opened it. Langford stood there, looking like a man who had lost everything. His once pristine suit was slightly disheveled, his usual arrogance gone. But there was something else in his eyes now. Desperation. Leonard didn't invite him in. He simply crossed his arms and leaned against the doorframe. What do you want, Langford? Langford exhaled sharply. I need a deal. Leonard smirked. Oh? You mean like the ones you never gave my people? Langford's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. I'm willing to cooperate. Give you everything on Baxter. Just make sure I don't go down with him. Leonard studied him for a long moment. Then, with a small, knowing smile, he said, We'll see. Arrogance blinds, but knowledge is power. Garrett Langford walked into that courtroom thinking he had already won. But in life, underestimating the wrong person can be your downfall. Leonard didn't need tricks or manipulation. He had facts, experience, and the patience to strike at the perfect moment. This story is a powerful reminder that titles and wealth don't make you invincible. Respect is earned, and when you play dirty, the truth will always catch up. So remember this: never judge a person by their appearance. The quietest ones often have the most power. Make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on post notification to be the first to know when interesting and lesson-packed stories like this one drop.